said, GHS means Global Harmonization System, and HC, Hazard Communication. You might see those acronyms throughout the presentation. Just as a point of reference, if you really want to know the bottom line of all of this, you guys, the folder that you've received is very important. And the reason is because if we ever get audited, that information being handy and readily accessible by any employee, that's number one. Number two, it has to have safety data sheets, which we'll discuss. And along with it, label and logging. That's what it all boils down to. If you have any chemical come on the property, not any of the tenants, but any that come into your office or into a company-owned unit, we have to label and log it if it is a hazardous material. The good news is 90% of the stuff we get already labeled, so we don't really even have to log it. But if there's something you put in, let's say a generic spray bottle, that's where we need to be very, very careful. So that's kind of the bottom line, and I'll of course finish summarizing all that. But let's go through the training as required by OSHA. This I thought would take about 45 minutes, but yesterday's session took 35. So let's just rock and roll through this. And any comments, questions, or concerns, let's hold them to the end. I can't see all the chatting simultaneously while I do the presentation, so I'd like to hold those questions to the end. And I don't see anybody else coming on board, so I think we're really in good shape. So let's move forward. There is something I want to check before we get going. One thing I want to check. Alrighty, there we go. Excellent. Is the sound, can I get a thumbs up if the sound is good at your end? Excellent. I'm trying to eliminate any echoing that might come in indirectly by me using a second laptop here. Trying to make sure I see everything that you see. All right, let's move on. So lesson objectives: identify the employer's responsibilities under the HCS, including training requirements. We have to identify components of a hazard communication program, the folder being one, this training being another. We have to describe requirements of the different types of hazard communication labels. Labels are very, very, very important. They're kind of the crux of the program because that's what helps everybody and anybody to manage any hazardous situations that may come about due to a hazardous chemical released on our facility. Also, being able to locate pertinent information about chemicals on labels, including other forms of hazard communication, to ensure right to understanding, and I will cover that in just a moment, right to understanding provisions of the GHS requirement. So a little case study here to give you a little perspective and why these programs are so important. And this goes to the issue of the right to understand. And so I'm just gonna share this case history with you. Workers have sometimes had difficulty understanding information presented on safety data sheets. You'll see that acronym SDS on numerous occasions in the presentation. And it happens that in some cases, the length and complexity of the documents of the SDS have made it difficult for workers to locate important safety information. In one particular instance, a case study here, a hospital safety director describes a situation in which a worker was unable to find critical information on an SDS in an emergency situation. It goes as follows. 2 gallons of the chemical xylene spilled in the lab of this hospital. By the time an employee had noticed the spill, the ventilation had already sucked most of the vapors into the HVAC system. This in turn became suspended in the ceiling tiles above the lab and obviously became a hazardous situation. 12 of their employees were sent to the emergency room. To make matters worse, the lab employee was frantically searching through the binder in her area for the SDS information on xylene and what to do. Once she found it, she had difficulty locating the spill response section, like what do you do when this is exposed to personnel. And after notifying an engineer in the engineering department, She began to clean up the spill as she thought she should with solid waste rags. Well, these rags are known for spontaneous combustion, and placing the rags, and she placed the rags into a clear plastic bag for disposal. What she didn't know is that xylene has a flash point of 75 degrees Fahrenheit. She then walked the bag down to the incinerator room and left it there, basically creating a live time bomb. No kidding. And 12 people were treated from this exposure. The lab employee was very, very upset and concerned about the safety of the affected employees and visitors, as well she should have, and hysterically kept stating that she could not find the necessary spill response information. So, in her, frantic efforts to make things right, she actually complicated the situation. So, understanding that, yeah, this kind of stuff happens all the time, and we just have to be, sensitive to it. The Global Harmonization System program has been around for a while. They've done a lot of studies and surveys. They say that many lives, approximately 43 per year, can be averted, and approximately 585 per year where injuries and illnesses are concerned can be averted by doing this training. And also, obviously, a great deal of money can be saved by properly training people and having everyone properly prepared. If you want more information, more statistics, there's a good website for you to go to. All of this information is readily available. 7 major elements in the GHS aligned hazard communication standards. We're going to talk about all of these very briefly. Again, the most important thing is the safety data sheets on any chemical that comes on property. You'll just, insert that in your folder, label it, log it, and you're good. We found that in many instances, you guys probably may not have a single hazardous chemical on your property, but nevertheless, storage facilities nationwide fall under the Global Harmonization System as one of the vertical markets that needs or requires this training. So the 7 major elements are the safety data sheet, the labels, signal words, hazard statements, precautionary statements, pictograms, and ultimately this training. That's what makes up the GHS training. Employer responsibilities, pretty straightforward: to ensure labels are on incoming labels and not defaced. They maintain the SDS forms from the moment it's shipped or received. Ensure SDSs are readily accessible in the folder. Ensure chemicals in workplace are properly labeled, tagged, or marked. All that's important. Obviously, provide information and training to employees, which we're doing now. Provide information access for employees in multi-employer workplaces. Kind of applies to us because some of us, move from facility to facility. So you have to know, I can always go to that folder, the one with the pictogram on the front. That's, that's the one that's going to help me if there's any, hazardous chemicals released at the facility. And finally, develop, implement, and maintain a written hazard communication program. That, of course, is the folder itself. Hazard communication program requirements for a written program: develop, implement, and maintain a written hazard communication program, as just mentioned, and maintain intent to ensure compliance with standards in a systematic way that coordinates all elements, which basically tells us at the home office, we need to have this as an ongoing program. Ray had spoken at length about creating a safety committee. Well, for all practical purposes, this is the beginning of those safety procedures. Hazard communication program components of the written program. First, list of hazardous chemicals present at a work site, excuse me, of which there won't be many in our particular case. The availability of the SDS sheets to employees and downstream employee and employers, all of that is relevant. Labeling of chemical containers. Obviously, the labeling is the most important thing. Second to that is the logging. And then third would be the SDS sheet describing those chemicals on the premises. And then the training programs regarding hazards of chemicals and what protective measures which is part of the labeling. You know, a part of the label is going to say not only what is this hazardous material, what does the pictogram say, and what with the keywords tells us what to do if there's a spill. List of hazardous chemicals. Well, we're going to use what's called product identifiers, meaning product name, common name, or chemical name, same as the name that is used on the SDS and the label. In other words, we need to be consistent. If xylene is on the label, xylene needs to be in the log. Xylene needs to be in the keywords, yada, yada, yada. Inventory of chemicals. Employer must have available an SDS for each of the bottles that might be on our facility that contain a hazardous chemical. Also covers all chemicals in all forms, whether contained or not, and also include chemicals in containers, pipes, and those generated by work operations, which generally doesn't apply to us. Okay, the all-important safety data sheet, available and accessible to workers. It is if you've got it in the folder. It's required for all hazardous chemicals used. Do not use hazardous chemicals if there is no SDS available. And we are going to continue on with a 16-section format that kind of breaks this down, this sheet. SDS documentation, designated persons, meaning you, facility manager, responsible for obtaining and maintaining SDS. That's the data sheets. How do you maintain them? You just keep them in the binder, the folder that we provided you. Describe how SDSs are maintained and how employees can access them. So that just means you got to make sure everybody knows where the folder is. You must have SDS for each chemical, as mentioned before, and train workers on SDS format and use. So what does that translate into? Well, the Hazard Communication Program has these statistical data sheets, okay, and there's 16 sections, or there's a format, 16 elements, if you will. First, identification. Second, hazard identifications. What harm can it cause? The composition or information or ingredients, so you immediately know what it is you're dealing with. First aid measures, obviously. Firefighting measures, should the chemicals be combustible. And accidental release measures. What do we do if it spills? What do we do if it gets in our eye? What do we do if it gets in the air? That kind of stuff. And then the handling and storage safely, like xylene, you can't put it where the flash point is 75 degrees. So very important you understand how to handle the stuff. A lot of stuff you probably don't want out, for example, in our company-owned unit because it might get too hot, and it'd be better if you kept it in the office in safekeeping. Exposure control, personal protection, physical and chemical properties of the chemicals, stability and reactivity. In other words, is it okay until it's below a certain temperature or above a certain temperature, things like that. Toxicology information. 12, 13, 14, and 15 are not regulated by OSHA, but they're recommended that if you have a chemical, you want to understand its ecological impact, its disposal considerations when you're unloading the chemical, what to do or not to do when transporting it, and regulatory information. There you have it. That's what an SDS sheet should have in order to be perfecto. Labeling. All containers of hazardous materials must be labeled. The good news is, in your folder on the left sleeve, I provided you an example of what one of those labels looks like, and we will review that in just a minute. The most important part of the label, perhaps, is the immediate warning of what you need to be concerned about with regards to that chemical. And it gives you a snapshot of hazard and protective information. So let's look at it. Designated persons responsible for labeling and compliance. That's you, the facility manager. These labels describe alternatives to labeling of stationary process containers, which I have no idea what that means. And then ensure all workplace containers are labeled appropriately, obviously. Labels include training, the training that we're providing now, the training in the folder. Shipping and workplace containers doesn't really apply to us. Procedures for reviewing, updating workplace label information is essentially, this is an ongoing process. So as you bring something on board, you want to make sure everybody knows, all right, this is like xylene, this is dangerous. Here's the label, and we keep it here. Don't mess with it. So it's an ongoing program, and the labeling is supposed to essentially be able to notify anyone who hasn't been brought up to speed. But obviously, standard operating procedure is as a new chemical comes in, make sure everybody knows about it, and the label's placed on it so that if a new employee comes and they haven't been aware, they'll see on the label, you know, okay, this is perhaps a dangerous chemical that I need to be aware of. Required elements for a shipping label. This is, you know, we don't ship stuff in and out, but nevertheless, this is a good example of what you'll find on the labels that I've provided in the folder. Name, address, telephone number, product identifier, signal words, hazard statements, precautionary statements, and the pictograms. All of those are relevant pieces of information. I believe we're going to break that down for you here in just a minute. Some of the requirements for workplace labels, okay? Employers can create own labeling systems that work for their workplace or employees. It doesn't really apply to us, nor do we really want to be mavericks or get off the reservation. We're just going to stick with, you know, what standard operating procedure is as dictated by OSHA. You can choose same label required for shipped containers or alternative labels as long as they provide general information about the hazard. Again, it really doesn't apply to us, nor do we need to train employees to understand the shipping and receiving of hazardous chemicals, because that's just not, you know, that's more for manufacturers and hospitals and other vertical markets that tend to ship and receive a lot of chemicals. HCS shipping labels, again, this is a little redundant, but nevertheless, I think this is actually the label I used in the folder. You can check that out. And again, if you'll just fill out, you know, what's required by the label in here, you'll notice that it's pretty straightforward. Perhaps the most important elements of the label, first is the product identifier or the pictogram. This obviously signal words and hazard statements. These things right here, this is what makes up the good label. Other information like name, address, telephone number, you know, all that's relevant, but certainly and pertinent, but not as important as the first four: the identifier, the pictogram, the signal word, and the hazard statement. I'll go ahead and review those real quick. So again, contact information at the bottom, product identifier, signal word, danger, danger, danger. And the pictogram usually is what most people recognize as the easy identifier of, oh, hey, this is something I gotta, you know, pay attention to. You'll notice that there are a lot of different types of pictograms. I actually made copies of these labels, these pictograms, and I put them in the folder so that if you do label a bottle, you can just make a copy of that sheet, cut out. Sorry about that. So that you can just make a copy and paste that on the container. Yeah, skull and crossbones. That's like, you know, pretty clear. Wouldn't you agree? Okay. All right, signal words, like we said, hazard statement or precautionary statement. All of these are elements of a good label. And you'll notice here's a regular container, and it has all those components. It's in the fine print, but nevertheless, those pictograms pretty much screen that, hey, there's something here that could be potentially dangerous. So you guys get the gist here, right? I mean, when you bring something into the facility that goes into a generic spray bottle, for instance, just snap up one of those labels that I provided in the folder, cut out a pictogram, slap it on there, and we're good. That's the bottom line. All right, so locating information. In which section of an SDS would you find, this is, by the way, we're wrapping it up here. In which section of an SDS would you find the following information? hazard identification, such as hazard classification, signal word, and precautionary statements. Well, that would be in section 2, the hazards identification, that part of the label, section 2. Initial care instructions for untrained responders attending to an individual has been exposed to the chemical. Well, that would be in first aid measure. Recommendations for PPE, that's section 8. Now you're wondering what sections, Paul, what are you talking about? Those are the 16, right, of the SDA, the safety data sheets, okay? There's 16 sections. So as you bring a chemical on board, okay, and you fill out the SDS and you put it in the folder, okay, all of this information should be compiled about that particular chemical. Basically, if we were ever to be audited, as long as you have labeled and logged something, you're in good standing. If you've gone to the nth degree and you've gone through all 16 of those things that a safety data sheet should have, wow, you're a superstar and you're operating at the highest level of safety, which OSHA is recommending. So in summary, employer's responsibility under HCS, in this module, we covered that. We also covered the components of the communication program, meaning the training, the safety data sheets, the labels, the logging, this training, and of course, again, the folder, the binder, very, very important. Requirements of different types of hazard communication labels. I think we're pretty thorough on that. And how to locate pertinent information. It's on, the SDS sheets. Your right to understand is A, not simply shown or told. B, not simply given an SDS. C, required an initial assignment when things change. Or D, all of the above. Also, knowledge check. A hazard communication program requires which of the following components? A, written, B, SDS labeling, C, training. Could that possibly be D? All of the above. And how many sections are required on a really good, thorough safety data sheet? B, 16 sections. So there you have it, you guys. All in what? Oh my gosh, we did that in 25 minutes. We went through that quickly. Bottom line, you guys, is your folder. It enables you to log and label appropriately and describe any hazardous materials. The SDS sheet is important so that if someone other than you, the facility manager, runs into a hazardous situation, that sheet and those 16 elements is basically going to give someone a fair shot at recovering from a spill or, being able to administer first aid if necessary. This stuff is no joke. These kind of hazards do happen occasionally. And now, thanks to Ray's foresight, we now are properly prepared for that. And like I said, bottom line, log, label, use the pictograms. Those are helpful. And thank you. Your safety is always a Storage Solutions top priority.